Now, without further ado, may I please present Professor Roger Ebbetson, who is going to introduce our keynote speaker, Phillip Mallett.
Yes. Morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. It's conventional, I think, to often say someone needs no introduction, but when people say that, they then go on and give an introduction anyway, which I shall do. Philip is now Honorary Senior Lecturer in English at St Andrews, having recently retired. He's also Honorary Research Fellow at Lancaster University, with which I'm also associated at the moment. He's, of course, a Vice President of the Hardy Society and the Thomas Hardy Association, and he's been since 2008 the editor of our journals, as I'm sure we all know. And I'd just like to say a word about that, because I think it's a huge task, an editorial task, which, my own feeling, Philip executes with absolute aplomb and has produced really. It's an enormous burden of work. I think we don't see 90% of it. And I'd just like to pay tribute to Philip as editor. I think he's absolutely exemplary, and we need him to carry on in that role for many years. In addition to essays on a whole range of writers, right back to John Donne, right up to Larkin and Heaney, his published work includes a biography of Kipling, on which he's also an authority, and editions of Return of the Native and Mare of Casterbridge for Norton, and of the Woodlanders for Wordsworth Classics, and Under the Greenwood Tree for OUP. He's edited, as we all know, I'm sure, a number of excellent collections of essays, particularly Thomas Hardy in Context for Cambridge University, and one on the Victorian novel Masculinity for Palgrave Macmillan. We all know that Philip, I'm going to stop now, but we all know that Philip is absolutely indefatigable, and he's currently working on a new edition of Tess for Norton and of the Mare of Casterbridge for the Cambridge edition of Hardy's complete works. So, without further ado, great pleasure to welcome Philip, whose paper I know has been very interestingly prepared in a variety of venues, and his title today is on the Woodlanders, The Body in the Woods. Philip.
Just wondering if I sit on this table, if that's just going to mean keeps you all on tenterhooks, when the table collapses and I fall off, so perhaps I won't do that. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Roger. My real distinction in Hardy Studies is actually quite different. I have supervised 3 postgraduate theses in completing the last couple of years, which have become monographs. Karen Curler's on Victorian communication, which looks at Hardy and the use of letters in his fiction. Jacqueline Dillon on Thomas Hardy, Folklore and Resistance, both of those published by Palgrave. And at the end of this month, Anna West's book, Thomas Hardy and Animals, will be published by Cambridge University Press. To have had some sort of role as male midwife for 3 such outstanding pieces of work, that's really my contribution to Hardy Studies. I'm far more proud of that than anything else that I've done in my academic life. So I'm probably embarrassing Karen by saying it, but I'm not going to apologise. She can just be embarrassed and jolly well like it. The title, Body in the Woods, is the only joke that I've got, because it makes it sound as if it's going to be an Agatha Christie story. But this is not a novel which is filled with jokes, and there aren't going to be any in the lecture. The one thing that did occur to me on rereading the novel was something that must have been lurking in the back of my mind for some time, about the odd way in which Hardy chooses characters' names. Many of them perfectly straightforward, and you pay no attention to them. But some of them have obviously got some kind of element of humour in them. The man-hunting maid Menlove is a fairly obvious example. The Scotsman who's far frae hame when he comes down in the Mayor of Casterbridge is another rather obvious example, but it hadn't occurred to me until I was writing it down that Dr. Dread in this novel is another. Dr. Edred is Dread. Now, I can't believe that's wholly accidental, and Hardy, writing it down as he wrote through the manuscript, must have noticed that he was writing D-R-E-D-R-E-D. So Dr. Dread, there you are, that's as near as I can come to finding a moment of deliberate humour tucked away in the novel. As we, as readers, walk through the opening chapters of the Woodlanders, can I just say, if you can't hear me in the back, and Byron, you'd be a good test case, will you just jump up and down and wave one of those flags so that I know that you can't hear me? As we walk through the opening chapters, we track Barber Perkin as he in turn follows the track leading to Marty South's cottage. And as we do that, we probably don't notice with any great attention the reference to the elm tree that will eventually cause the death of John South, and in doing so leave his daughter Marty and his neighbour Giles homeless, and in the process help destroy what chance there might have been that Giles and Grace would marry. Half a dozen dwellings, we're told, were passed without result. The next, which stood opposite a tall tree, was in an exceptional state of radiance, the flickering brightness from the inside shining up the chimney and making a luminous mist of the emerging smoke. It's not until a few pages later that we learn that this radiance, a word that for Hardy is nearly always associated with love, in this case is a result of the fact that Marty is having to work hard late at night because her father is incapacitated by his terror that this tall tree is going to fall and kill him. Now, it is the case that elm trees do occasionally, unexpectedly, drop their limbs. Jacqueline Dillon's book, Folklore and Resistance, quotes the proverb, "Ellum hateth man and waiteth," which makes the tree sound fairly scary. And the height of the tree does clearly put it within reach of John South's house. But clearly his terror is morbid rather than rational. He says, when it was quite a small tree and I was a little boy, I thought one day of chopping it off, but I put off doing it. And then I again thought I would, but I forgot and didn't. And at last it's got too big, and now 'tis my enemy and will be the death of me. Dr. Fitzpiers, Dread, the modern man of science, thinks it's an extraordinary case, though Marty South tells us that others have been like it afore in Hintock. We hear no more about these others, but we do notice later that when Grandma South has sold her brain, she too gets a kind of morbid nervous disease. She's hitherto all her life been completely healthy, but now she knows that she's sold her brain. She starts to suffer from aches and pains and gets anxious. Fitzpiers' advice, which seems to me, I have to say, perfectly sensible, is to cut the tree down and reassure John South that he can outlive it. But the power of auto-suggestion is much stronger. South sees the gap where the tree stood and falls down dead. But it's his mind that kills him, rather than the tree. So right near the beginning of the novel, we find ourselves wrestling with the question about how does the mind work on the body, or the body work on the mind? And it's a question that I think fascinates Hardy, and what I want to do is to explore some of the ways in which it manifests itself as we read through the novel. One of Fitzpiers' hobbies is craniology. He flatters Grandma Oliver into selling him her brain by telling her how large it is. A woman's, he says, is usually 4 ounces less than a man's, but yours is man's size. Now, this is actually a serious issue in the 1880s. Craniology, the weighing of brains and so on, was becoming a science used to make racial distinctions, but also to make distinctions about intelligence. It was assumed that the brain size correlated exactly with intelligence. This is why donkeys are so much smarter than fox terriers, for example. Why nobody actually looked around the physical world and thought this clearly doesn't hold, goodness only knows. No one actually thought to themselves, there's a cow with an enormous brain, and there's a Jack Russell with a very small brain, so clearly the cow's smarter than the Jack Russell. But nonetheless, these ideas were taken seriously. George Romanes, whom Hardy knew and whose work Hardy took notes on, explained that the reason women should be debarred from higher education was, in his words, nothing can make up for the missing 5 ounces of brain. So I'm terribly sorry for those who struggle with this lecture, and that's clearly the reason why. Fitzpiers doesn't get Graham's brain. He does dissect that of John South, and he shows Grace a section of it through his microscope. A circle of light patterned all over with a cellular tissue of some indescribable sort. Hardy's male and female characters come together over odd things. Clym and Eustacia over a funeral urn. Jude and Arabella Dunn over the sexual organs of a pig. Even Angel Clare and Tess. The first time Angel Clare seriously takes notice of Tess is when she's talking about how your soul can go out of your body, and Dairyman Crick is so astonished by this that he plants his knife and fork on the table like a gallows. So, people's first meetings in Hardy normally have some kind of ill omen, and the fact that Grace and Fitzpiers first speak while looking at the tissue of the brain of a man who died of some kind of self-induced morbid disease is not promising. We can only guess at what he's doing. He's probably weighing the brain, tracing the convolutions, the cerebral cortex, and if he's up to date with techniques developed by medical researchers in the 1870s, he might be using dyes to stain the tissues. What he tells Grace he's doing is looking for a point of connection between the material world of a brain that can be weighed and measured and dissected, and the idealist one, the world of idea, thought, and feeling. That is, he wants to see how our mental life connects to our inner, to our physical life. His failure in the case of John South suggests he's not likely to be very successful. For all his interest in the interior of his patients' skulls, he's not actually likely to show much understanding of their interior life. That is, their complexities of human impulse, desire, motivation, any more than he shows much intelligent interest in his own motives and desires. But even as Hardy shows Fitzpiers' inadequacies as man and doctor, he engages with a lot of the questions that Fitzpiers is also investigating. So at several moments in the novel, for example, he speculates or implies speculations about what the brain is like. He sees it as a kind of container with a finite capacity, like a box, that you can only put a certain amount of stuff in it. So Melbury's pleasure in seeing Grace home again doesn't simply cause him to forget the presence of Giles, which is one way of putting it. What it does is it thrusts Giles' image back into quite the obscurest cellarage of his brain. As if the brain is a kind of house and you stick a piece of information away in a remote corner of an attic. And the same notion of the brain as a finite space, where if you want to put in one more thing, you must take out something that's already there, occurs later when we're told, for example, that Melbury's constant talking about Fitzpiers causes a displacement in Grace's mind. So much pressure, we're told, couldn't help but produce some kind of displacement. The amount of space taken up by Fitzpiers pushes aside the space that once upon a time would have been given to Giles. Sherlock Holmes, some of you will no doubt be remembering, has much the same idea. Holmes explains at one point to Watson that he doesn't know that we live in a heliocentric system, because the fact that the Earth goes around the Sun is of no use to him whatever as the detective. And so he doesn't want that piece of information because it would just clutter up his mind. And it could have been a more useful piece in that little cellarage in his brain. The unhappy Marty South, shorn of a wonderful phrase, her one bright gift of time, explains that she's got 3 headaches simultaneously, but they're all precisely located. There's a rheumatic headache in my poll. There's a sick headache over my eyes, and a misery headache in the middle of my brain, tucked away. The head and its contents are made insistently literal in this novel. Ideas come and go into people's heads. Heads throb with pain, or they get cool in the night air. Giles endlessly shakes his head. I hadn't noticed this until I read through the novel through again, but he shakes his head some 7 or 8 times in the course of the novel, and nearly as often he wrinkles his forehead. Melbury always jerks his head. So, for example, when one of the workmen asks him a question, he walks away without answering, and they say, "What maggot has the gaffer got in his head now?" Again, you're being invited to think about the brain as something sort of physical, something tangible. When Fitzpiers gets tipsy because Melbury's given him some rum and it gets into his head. He complains about his life with Grace, and unfortunately does this to Grace's father, whose brain, we're told, is on fire with indignation. Fitzpiers' presence doesn't so much as disturb Grace as produce an intoxication in her brain, so that she loses a sense of what she's been doing. Her father endlessly loses track of what's going on around him. When he's first told that Grace might be able to get a divorce, his brain seems to ring sonorously as a gong. The noise fills up his head, fills up his brain. So he leaves the pub where the conversation's been taking place without even noticing that he's done so. Other times, Hardy seems to be interested in the way in which the brain can work automatically. So the skills required for cops work become a kind of unconscious bodily memory, in which we're told the secondary intelligence of the hands and arms can carry on without the sovereign attention of the head. So head and body now, as we disconnect. The workers can go off and tell stories and gossip and still carry on with their work. Marty wakes early after her late night working to begin, we're told, those automatic initiatory acts and touches which accompany the start of every day. She doesn't have to think about doing them. They happen automatically without the sovereign attention of the head. Giles proceeds automatically with his work, shrouding the elm, as Grace passes by underneath and doesn't acknowledge him. He's thinking about Grace, but he's automatically continuing with his work. When Grace sees Suk Damson cracking nuts with her teeth, by an automatic chain of thought, her mind goes back to Fitzpiers' lie about having taken out one of Suk Damson's teeth. And then near the end of the novel, as Giles lies dying, Fitzpiers and Grace for a moment almost forget that they're a separated husband and wife, as he speaks with automatic authority to tell her what she needs to do to look after him. There are something like 8 or 10 references to the word automatic in the novel. Characters sometimes go even further than this. They become somnambulists. Most obviously, Fitzpiers literally sleeps on his way back from Mrs. Charlotte when he comes back by horseback and is found asleep on the horse. But Giles caresses the flower on Grace's dress with the abstraction of a somnambulist. And part of the reason he does this is because he's seen the gesture done by Fitzpiers towards Mrs. Charlotte, and it's the unconscious imitation. So he's a sleepwalking man who unconsciously imitates something done by a sleepwalking man. Clearly, Hardy is interested quite seriously in what happens in here and how that relates to what happens in the physical world around us. The word abstracted or abstraction is used 10 times in the novel, and the word unconscious 17 times, to refer to those moments when mental life and bodily action seem somehow to get disconnected. And you will, I'm sure, remember scenes, and perhaps the most notable is the one when Grace sees Fitzpiers' eyes apparently open, as if he's looking at her, and he has no conscious memory of having seen her. The narrator tells us he had opened his eyes for a few moments, but had immediately relapsed into unconsciousness, if indeed he had ever been positively awake. There's a kind of borderline state between awareness and unawareness, and the characters keep on finding themselves in that state. So time and again they fail to notice what's happening outside them because they're preoccupied with the images in their own mind. Giles forgets, first of all, that he's supposed to be working with Marty planting trees. And then as he starts planting the trees, he works on forgetful of the fact that he's physically moving, so keeping warm, whereas poor Marty is standing still and is chilled half to death. It simply doesn't enter his mind. Grace listens to Giles talking about John apple trees and bittersweets at the beginning of the novel, but the narrator tells us she's inwardly beholding a far remoter scene. And there's a scene about girls at play on the lawn and in a fashionable city suburb. And her imagination is so intense that she hears the notes of piano and harp trembling in the air from the open windows adjoining. Now, I think Hardy must have been quite curious about this, because it's not just that we're told that Grace can hear these things in her imagination, but of course as readers, we also start to see these things or hear these things in our imagination. We actually echo, as readers, exactly what's happening in the novel. We're being told about one scene and simultaneously being asked to take our minds and imaginations off to another. Mr. Melbury spends half the novel blind to what's in front of him. When he learns that Fitzpiers is interested in Grace, he enters the house, we're told, with the look of a man who sees a vision before him. So we're asked to look at a man who can't look back because he's looking at a vision in the space where we ought to be. He's looking at the vision before him. It's again that sense of a disconnect between the mental life and the physical life. Later on, when he's worried about Grace, what he sees isn't the world in front of him, but a tragic vision which he carries around with him like an envelope. Extraordinary image. A man, not just enveloped, but like an envelope. When Grace looks at Fitzpiers, who's looking out over a gate, his attention is fixed on the landscape far away. And when she gets close, she can see his lips moving unconsciously as to some impassioned visionary theme. The theme, of course, being Mrs. Charlotte. And the word vision, or visionary, in the sense of something seen by the inner eye or conjured up by the imagination, something which isn't there but fills up whatever it is that's involved in mental vision. That occurs about a dozen times in the novel. Now, all of this, I think, suggests something of a paradox. On the one hand, we're reminded that our mental and emotional life begins in the body and works on the body. It's located in the brain. There are maggots in the brain, or pains in the brain, or cold air is cooling the brain. On the other, we're reminded that the inner or visionary world regularly overtakes our awareness of the outside world. But the novel, I think, never forgets that we are embodied physical beings, that all the characters in the novel are bodies in a wood. People and the world act on each other. Each alters the other. It adds new layers to the other, or makes marks on it, or traces on it, or sometimes it subtracts or wipes out or removes part of the surface of the other. So among the additions, and again I'm sure you'll come up with other from your own memories of the novel, the smoke mark left on the ceiling where Grace has been reading. The candlelight made a smoke mark on the ceiling, which I noticed because my daughter likes to have a bath using a candle, and I've got similar marks on my bathroom ceiling. We're told that Melbury's taken care not to remove it. I just wish you could tell me how you could remove it so I can actually get rid of the one that my daughter Molly was about. But we might think about other things. For example, the blisters on Marty's hands. And you think how vivid this is. Her hand is not red and blistered. Her hand is red and blistering. We're actually sort of lured into the process of it happening at that very moment. Or the scratches and blemishes on Soup Damson's arms, which are half hidden in the moonlight when Fitzpiers chases her into the haystack. Or the thumb stains on the back of the playing cards that the hollow turner and the rest of them play at Giles' unhappy party. Or, more happily, the coating of apple rind and pips, which covers Giles when he's cider making. Less happily, something that seemed me to catch much of the mood of the novel, that pervasive whitey brown that Melbury says creeps out of the earth over everything. In many ways it seems to be almost the keynote of the novel. This is a novel which seems to be very melancholy in many ways, as if a whitey brown something had crept out and dampened things down and left characters feeling slightly less vivid, slightly less brilliant than they might otherwise have been. So those are additions, but there are also subtractions, incisions, indentations, or polishes that actually start to remove things. So again, you'll find your own examples, but there are initials carved into the door jambs of Melbury's house. There's Grace's footprint left in the mud and covered by a tile by Melbury to protect it. Or the gleaming silver nails in the soles of Giles' boots as he climbs up the tree and Grace looks upwards and can see them. Hardy is a great, great poet, and even in the novels his imagination works poetically by association, by one word hanging around in his memory for 100 pages, so he comes back to it. And if you tune into that when you're reading the novel, when you get near the end, those silver nails will just be on the edge of your consciousness when you discover that Marty has now got Giles' spade. It's too big for her, she can't handle it. But it's burnished, we're told, so completely that it was bright as silver. Giles, the living man, polishes the nails on his boots by daily work. Now he's a dead man. Marty polishes his spade. She keeps it shining bright. And there's a little echo between those things, and it seems extraordinarily poignant. One of those many moments in the novel that bring tears to your eyes. Even the carved stone horse, Fitzpier's family seat, decayed as it now is, glisten with moisture where the cattle have been licking. Now, all these marks disclose a story. There's a nice hint about this in the novel when we're told about Creedle's motley collection of clothes. He's got a cast-off soldier's jacket, he's got a cast-off huntsman's top boots, and he's got a sailor's pocket knife. And all these things, we're told, are silent testimonials to previous lives. And all these marks I've been describing, whether they're marks imposed upon something or as well extracted from it, subtracted from it, or all these marks too disclose a story. That mark on Grace's ceiling tells you about her reading habits. Those thumbprints on the cards in Giles's house tell you about generations of people whom the narrator helpfully tells us are now fleshless in the grave, but their thumbprints still live on. Hardly we've been fascinated by the idea of traces of DNA that you can detect generations later being right up the street. The various aches and pains in Melbury's body map out a history of his working life, such as the limp in one leg caused, we're told, by the crash of an elm against it when they felled it. Elm hateth man and waiteth. It got Melbury, and another one against Johnson. He's altered the woods as a woodsman, and the woods have left their mark on him. Not just visible marks, but internal marks, marks which actually produce cramps and aches and pains. Some of these marks will fade, or themselves being rubbed and polished away. One assumes that the chalk mark made by the card players on Giles' table will be polished away. One hopes that the oil stains on Grace's dress made by the nice boy trying to polish the furniture will eventually be washed away, though she does explain it's an old dress. Some of the other marks will change their nature. Those blistering hands that Marty Selp has, we're told, will eventually turn into calluses. They will harden. Others of those marks will actually just keep on being made over and over, and they'll destroy the surfaces on which they're being made. Giles' boots, if he'd lived longer, would eventually wear out. Those Norman's carvings will eventually be made to crumble by the endless licking of hundreds and hundreds of cattle. So the world of the novel is a continuous process of change and interchange, making and unmaking. Men paint a gate white. Fitzpiers watches as the paint gets first on Suit Damson's light gown, then on Marty's black frock. Much later, Fitzpiers, after his quarrel with Melbury, climbs over another white gate and leaves paint on it. And Philly Shum has to come and sponge the paint on. So however vivid our mental life may be, however distracted we might get from what's physically happening around us, however much we see not the trees in front of us but dancing girls on the lawn, Hardy never lets us forget that the body we're moving around in is this physically embodied thing which is constantly in touch with the world, making marks and being marked. All of this, I think, is of a piece with what one critic, John Good, calls Hardy's humanisation of nature. That Tracy was saying in that sort of long menu of things that we could, in theory, write about, and I suppose in theory I could carry on talking about, but one of those is nature in the novel. But nature in the novel is hardly ever natural. It's nearly always got human activity imposed upon it. One point in the novel, Fitzpiers, forgetful of this, is watching labourers stripping bark from the trees, and he thinks about sacrificing all practical aims to live in calm contentment here. What this really means is he's too lazy to get on with his practical aims, and so he's sitting there with the book half asleep, and he imagines that he's somehow doing something profound and calm and contented. In fact, what he's looking at isn't a calm world at all. The barking, we're told, is a flaying process, like the shaving of the executioner's victim, preparatory to the guillotine. The barkers attack the body of the tree like locusts. The boughs Marty works on are quivering as if in pain. Marty is encaged by the branches as she works there. The trees look ashamed of their nudity. The axeman puts them out of their misery by chopping them down. So the natural world doesn't speak about itself, or not about itself only. It speaks at least as much about our human capacity for torture and for violence. And that refusal to separate, to borrow the title of any number of essays written in the 19th century by philosophers, to separate man and nature, is something that's evident throughout the novel. And next half dozen quotations, I'm sure, if you make pencil marks in the margins of your text, you'll discover that you've got pencil marks against these. The trees rubbing each other into wounds make noises like vocalised sorrows. The blear white visage of a sunless winter day emerges like a dead-born child. The dangling arms of ivy grope in vain for some support. The mossed roots of trees resemble hands wearing green gloves. Trees are wrinkled like an old crone's face. The woods break out into a cold sweat. The surfaces of plants are like weak, lidless eyes. A tree bangs against a roof in the manner of a gigantic hand smiting the mouth of an adversary. The stumps of rotting trees are like black trees rising from green gums. The timber dealers have their corkscrews twisted. They have their walks twisted into kind of corkscrew shapes, brought to that pattern, we're told, by the slow torture of an encircling woodbine during their growth, as the Chinese have been said to mould human beings into grotesque toys by continued compression in infancy. The image of the Chinese foot, bound and damaged, was an image that was used frequently in the 19th century, especially the second half of it, by women complaining about their situation in life. Florence Nightingale, for example, has an essay in which she says quite straightforwardly, what shape does the Chinese foot take? And what she's trying to say is the shape that women take in the social organisation of mid-19th century England is as deformed as the shape of the Chinese foot. So it's a familiar image. But Grace, we realise, is another such toy. But the imagery is not in this case of encircling woodbine. We're told she's been tilled into a fashionable view of the world, as if she's a piece of soil. She's been moulded with implanted tastes, as if some kind of genetic experiment had taken place in her. Cultivation, we're told, has now become advanced in the soil of her mind. And the images undermine any distinction we might want to try to make between nature on the one hand and culture on the other. When Grace tries to separate what's natural to her from what her culture has taught her to feel, she's unable to do so. And if one were to pursue that thought, I'd want to spend some time talking about the strange phrase that's used about her not feeling the sort of jealousy that the narrator tells us it was her duty to experience. If you're going to feel jealousy, it's one of the most appalling kinds of human emotion, because you know it's so degrading to yourself as well as so morally wrong to feel jealousy. But nonetheless, when you feel it, you don't find yourself thinking you're doing it out of duty. But in a society that says you must be monogamous and that you really ought to fight off the women who come after your husband, you have a duty to experience jealousy. Now, those things also fascinate me, but I'm not going to go down that route. That difficulty in separating the cultural from the natural is there in one of the most charming passages in the novel. This is a passage when Grace watches Fitzpiers disappear into the landscape on his way, of course, to visit Phyllis Charmond, and then sees Giles emerge from it, looking and smelling like autumn's very brother. Capital A for autumn. So he doesn't really mean the season, does he? He means autumn's very brother, the way autumn is written about as a personified figure, in the way that you can talk about summer or spring as persons, as godlike figures. It's already a literary word. Take away the capital A and it's just autumn. Give it a capital A and it's autumn as imagined, as written about, as celebrated by poets or written odes to by Keats and so on. But his sunburn, the colour of wheat. His clothes are dyed with fruit stains. His hands are clammy with the sweet juice of apples. And the natural imagery for a moment is extended into Grace's emotional life. Her heart rises from its sadness like a released bow. Now here we might think, yes, we're beginning to get closer to something natural. And for a moment, Grace actually feels that nature is bountiful. It's taken away Fitzpiers, but it's replaced Fitzpiers with Giles. And there's a sense in which we might quite properly see that as being at least as Darwinian as anything else that happens in this novel. The constant struggle of one tree against another as they fight for light and water and nourishment and so on is a Darwinian struggle, and Hardy clearly presents it as one. Or you have that the nightly carnage which the narrator throws into a kind of casual sentence at the beginning of chapter 4, in which we're told that the owls have been eating the mice in the outhouses, and the rabbits have been eating the wintergreens, and the stoats have been sucking the blood out of the rabbits, as if this was just all stuff we take for granted. That's a Darwinian world. But Darwin's world isn't just about the struggle for existence. It's also about the plenitude of the natural world. It's true that every resource has to be fought for. Nothing comes easily. But it's also true that every available niche is filled up with some kind of life. There's never a gap. Something will always move into the gap and be there, as Giles is apparently moving into the gap supposedly made by Fitzpiers. I quoted a sentence just a moment ago about the trees rising out of the green moss and being compared to stumps of decayed teeth rising from green gums. A kind of grotesque image, even by Hardy standards. The sentence that follows is this. Further on were other tufts of... Sorry, try that again without stumbling over my words. Further on were other tufts of moss in islands divided by the shed leaves. Shed, as in having fallen from a tree. Sorry, out of context, that's not so clear. Further on were other tufts of moss in islands divided by the shed leaves. Variety upon variety. Dark green and pale green, moss-like little fir trees, like plush, like malachite stars, like nothing on earth except moss. Let's say that would be one of 16 references to moss in the novel. This is the mossiest of all Hardy's novels. It's also one of my favourite sentences in Hardy's fiction. It comes late on in the text. Grace is looking out when the sentence begins. Further on, it means further on in Grace's field of vision. She's looking out from Giles' hut. Unknown to her, less than 50 yards away, he's dying. Doesn't matter to the moss. The moss just grows on. It grows on like little fir trees. It grows on like plush. It grows on like stars. Like, in the end, nothing except itself, its own endless variety of colour and form. And there's that wonderful sense of the richness, the abundance of the natural world. This is the Hardy who notices such things, and among other things has noticed the extraordinary variety of mosses. Nature really is bountiful, even if it's also red in tooth and claw. But the moment when Grace's heart is like a released valve, when she seems to feel she can throw off the veneer of artificiality, when she feels she can become natural, as it were, move out of the cultural realm into a natural and spontaneous one, she's trying to do that towards Giles. And Giles is even more caught up in the world of propriety than Grace is. Grace suffers from it, but it actually kills Giles. Giles is the embodiment of natural energies. It's never going to work when Giles is the person who would rather lie dying in a hut of typhoid fever than actually lie on the floor in the same hut as the person he's in love with and who is separated from her husband. Now, we now come to what would be the most brilliant, the most exciting, the most original and rewarding part of the lecture, in which I talk a little bit more about the passivity that all these images of disconnected minds and bodies, or bodies being marked upon by the world, contribute to the novel. Unfortunately, there's not time for that bit, so the most brilliant bit is pushed to one side. But I'll just say very briefly about the passivity of the novel, because there are two things I think that it leads me to say that I would like to say something about. John South, in that passage I quoted near the beginning, talks about how he was going to chop down the tree. He was going to make it into a clothes prop, but he didn't. And then he meant to do it, but he forgot about it. And then he didn't do it. And now, again and again, the action is thought of but not carried through. The Woodlanders, we're told, continue to plant vegetables in places where there are overhanging branches which drop so much water on them that nothing ever grows. But every year they plant them again. Felice and Mrs. Charman, we're told, do nothing by deliberate intention. everything is against judgment. These are characters who, in their somnambulistic way, work on passively, automatically, routinely, without taking charge of their lives, or without even seeming to want to take charge of their lives. Now, I think this has something to do with whether or not we can think this novel is a tragedy, and I think it has something to do with the way in which you think about love in the novel, and those are the two things I want to move towards. In the opening chapter, the narrator tells us that dramas of a grandeur and unity, truly Sophoclean, can be enacted even in a small place like Hintock. And clearly they can be enacted in a small place like Casterbridge, or relatively small place like Casterbridge, because the Mayor of Casterbridge is very clearly a tragedy with all sorts of allusions and references to other forms of tragic writing. Like Oedipus, for example, he's brought down by the messenger who brings back news of a sin he committed in the past against the family. The narrative material of Tass is the story of a dairymaid who eventually kills the man who seduces her. Doesn't seem like the stuff of classical tragedy, but when the novel closes with a reference to Aeschylus, very few people are going to think, where's that come from? We recognise that this is tragedy. Throughout both those novels, Hardy shows the instinct which D.H. Lawrence said most clearly linked him with the great tragic writers. What he does, says Lawrence, is bring together the social and the mythic. He sets a smaller system of morality, that's the human one, within the vast, uncomprehended and incomprehensible morality of life itself. Now that also seems to me to be an incomprehensible phrase, but nonetheless there's some sense that Lawrence is saying that there's a small human world, but you have a sense there's a bigger world outside, and somehow that bigger world outside has to be made to bear on the human lives. But that ought to apply to the Woodlanders if what I've been saying, for example, about its Darwinian context is right. And yet it still seems to be difficult to think of the Woodlanders as a tragedy. If it is, presumably we have to imagine that the tragic hero is Giles. But for half the novel he's off stage. He's prominently there in the first third of the novel. He almost disappears in the middle third. And by the time we get to the end of the novel, he's an ill man who is drifting out of his own existence. Structurally, Grace is at the centre of the novel, since she belongs both to the rural world and the wider world. She's the one who crosses the border between the two most frequently and most freely. But very hard to think of her as a tragic figure, because she seems so uncommitted to her own life. When Melville says, seduce Giles, or make yourself available to Giles, she does so. When he says, no, I think Fitzpiers, she says, okay. When he says, no, go back to Giles, she says, okay. Only at the end does she go back to Fitzpiers. And that's only because of this extraordinary episode with the man trap when she finally goes off with him. And poor Mr. Melbury, I suppose what's one of the sadder moments of the novel, says, I have been a little misled in this. I imagine every parent's got some sympathy with that feeling. But I do think actually one of the sadly comic lines in the novel is when the Woodlanders, including Melbury, finally catch up with Grace and Fitzpiers at Sherton, the Earl of Wessex, and he says, I thought you had gone to get the parsley. Now, that doesn't seem to me the sort of remark that you associate with the tragic hero or heroine. So I can't find myself thinking of Grace as anything like a tragic figure, nor even Marty. Who seems to me to be, in some respects, the most sympathetic of the characters. There's no figure in this novel which, it seems to me, demands the maximum engagement we can give in the way that we feel about Jude or Tess or Henchard. Our attention is shared around among lots of people in the course of the novel. And that takes away the sense. These are all people who deserve our kindness and our affection and our sympathy. None of them are evil. None of them seriously wish to do harm. Not even the mad gentleman from Southern Carolina really wants to do any great harm. He's on the wrong side in the Civil War. Yeah. But that sense that our attention is diffused takes away the sense of this being, at any rate, a conventional kind of tragedy where you have something like a tragic hero or tragic heroine. Tragedy suggests life carried on with full intensity. Mike Irwin puts it very well when he says of Hardy's tragic heroes and heroines, they die of living out their personalities to the full. Even as they burn themselves out, he says, they proclaim themselves. And I think that's well said. And you find it obviously in the final words of some of the characters. Michael Henchard writes a will which says he doesn't want any mourners. He doesn't want any flowers put on his grave. To this I put my name, Michael Henchard. Is where he undoes himself with such force that he remakes himself in his will. Jude, the man of learning, the man whose life has been a tissue of quotations, dies quoting Job. It's true, he says, let the day perish when I was born, and the night in which it is said, there is a man-child conceived. But he dies quoting, he dies still very obviously being Jude. He still feels like Jude. His dying words are a kind of expression of his inner Judeness. These are the words, in fact, or they could have used the words that Hardy gives to Tess in the poem Tess's Lament. I'd have my life unbe. That's an extraordinary and wonderful phrase, because it's not the same as I wish I hadn't lived, or I wish I could just cease to live. It's as if you're saying, I want to rip myself out of existence with such force and such vigour that you can see the traces of where I've annihilated myself. I want, as it were, my own absence to be so absolute that you can almost see it. As if you want your life not just to not exist, but to be unravelled so you can see the threads falling apart. Tess herself, as it happens, in the novel, doesn't take that view of her life. She has quiet, accepting dying words. I am ready. But these two have their tragic resonance because they're echoes of words in both Hamlet and King Lear. The readiness is all, says Hamlet. But there's no character in the Woodlands, it seems to me, who lives and dies on these sort of absolute terms. Might argue that Giles dies for love, but really it's the more prosaic combination of the after effects of typhoid and this ridiculous sense of propriety that kills him. And he doesn't make a final speech. But it's hard to know quite when Giles ceases. There's no last assertion of self. He devolves or digresses. First of all, he stops coming to the hut, so we stop seeing him. Grace mistakes his cough for the sound of a squirrel or a bird. So even a distinct, recognisable sound starts to go away from him. And then Grace hears, we're told, low mutterings, at first like persons in conversation, but gradually resolving themselves into varieties of one voice, an endless monologue. But then it becomes less than a human monologue. Like that we sometimes hear from inanimate nature in deep secret places with water flows, or where ivy leaves flap against stones. This is a man who's kind of lapsing slowly out of existence, who's kind of regressing into something less than life. But he's not saying, I'd have my life unbe. He hasn't got a final word. This isn't a man proclaiming himself in the very act of dying. That reference to the sound we hear from inanimate nature in deep secret places where water flows might remind us that his name is Winterbourne, a stream that flows in the winter but dries up in the summer. The sound that Giles makes, even when he's dying, is a temporary sound that can't quite sustain itself through the seasons. So I can't see this as a tragic novel. Nor, I think, can you see the way love is represented in the novel as making it into a tragedy. So one way to describe the plot is to see it as a kind of chain. Someone was saying to me the other day that it's a novel where you always wish that the person would look over their shoulder and see the person who really loves them. If only Fitzpiers would look back, he would see Grace following him. If Grace would look back, she would see Giles. If Giles would look back, he would see Martin. And part of your sense in reading the novel, its sadness, is the sense that each of these people, all they had to do was laugh. And their life could at least have had some chance of happiness. But he doesn't have it, of course. Love in this novel is obviously of many kinds. There's the fidelity of Marty South, the sexual hoydenish character of Sue Bamson, the loyalty of Giles, the infatuation of Philip Sharman and so on. But in all cases, it's not so much chosen as endured. And in each case, if it adds any greatness to the character who feels it, the greatness is measured in terms of their pain and their capacity for suffering, not by their capacity for joy or creativity. If you think about the great tragic love stories, whether it's Tristan and Isolde or Troilus and Cresside, or Antony and Cleopatra, or even Heathcliff and Cathy. You feel that these are characters singled out from those around them by their capacity to love greatly and to feel greatly, not just to hurt greatly. But in this novel, it's the capacity to hurt that you become more aware of. 8 characters in the novel, if I count right, fall in love and have their hopes disappointed. Marty, Giles, Grace, Fitzpiers, Mrs. Sharman, the man Carolina, Soup Damson, Tim Taggs. That's 8. And that doesn't include the previous generation, Melbury's courtship of Giles' mother, which we can put in another list. The normal experience in life is not, as it is in Antony and Cleopatra, lots and lots of people being happy, but 2 people caught up against a world who get destroyed by it. The normal experience in this world is to fall in love without really wishing to discover that it's very painful, to be made miserable by it, and to endure it until eventually, like Phyllis Sharman, you get murdered, as presumed the general of South Carolina gets hanged, Tim Taggs and Soup Damson disappear off to the other side of the world, Giles dies, Marty's left a solitary figure. By solitary, we mean not just that she's physically on her own, but she's going to remain unmarried at the end of the novel. That's just the normal experience of life in this novel. So it's hard to think this is a novel which is like the normal kind of love tragedy. If anything, the mood of the novel is in this sense more like a comedy. I don't like comedy. In The Winter's Tale, Paulina says, it is required you to await your faith. And I just haven't got it. And I look at the statue of a dead person. I can believe in the person dying. I can't believe in them coming back to life again, as that play makes happen. Comedy says, it celebrates and reminds of what we have in common. Comedy reminds us that actually most of us are not going to be Antony and Cleopatra, or Tristan and Isolde, or Troilus and Cresside. I've met any number of first-year undergraduate men who think themselves being a bit like Heathcliff. And I have to say, how many men do you suppose, like Heathcliff, come and read English at the University of St Andrews? Edgar might come and read English at the University of St Andrews. Jude might have done. No, not Heathcliff, not the great passionate lovers. They've got other things to do than sit in my office in the University of St Andrews, or in Karen's office in Bangor, or Roger's in the various universities in which Roger was taught, or Hugh. However wonderful we might be as tutors and supervisors, the great lovers don't think, what I really need is a tutorial on the heart of darkness, so that I can actually be a great lover. What most of us do is we marry the person we meet in the tutorial, or the girl next door, or the boy next door, or someone we meet on a bus, or someone we meet at a conference. It used to be the case that 1 in 16 St Andrews students married each other. So you've got a class of 160 students in the first year lecture, and you can just ask them to look around and say, 10 of you are looking at your future partners. That would scare the life out of them. But that's what this novel reminds us of, that this is the ordinary experience. So what happens to Giles, what happens to Grace, what happens to Fitzpiers, what happens to Mrs. Sharman, it's kind of unsurprising. It's the ordinary level of experience. And that's why sometimes the characters all sound as if they're saying the same thing. Mrs. Sharman says, Little Hintock has the effect of bottling up the emotions till one can no longer hold them. Fitzpiers says, living life as a doctor in a country village leaves him charged with the emotive fluid. Grace goes to see Mrs. Sharman as a vessel of emotion. All of them have got something flowing inside, and it's just got to flow somewhere. Love becomes a subjective thing. It's the tree your rainbow falls on, in the wonderful way in which Giles summarised Fitzpiers' argument. It's not an elective affinity. It's not the case there's the one unique person. And Hardy hints at this by apparently offering us a plot that he then doesn't give us. The plot is the plot, as it were, like Far From the Madding Crowd. Girl meets boy, should have married boy but doesn't, goes off with the wrong one, discovers it's the wrong one, comes back and boy is fortunately still waiting for him, and so she can marry him in the end. It doesn't happen in this novel. It ought to happen, and I'm sure contemporary readers reading in the serial in the magazine would have expected to happen, is that Grace is with Giles, then she's with Fitzpiers, that's a terrible mistake, so eventually she will go back to Giles. Well, so she does Hardy opposites that. Let's take her back to Giles. And then let's kill Giles. Not Fitzpiers, but Giles, the wrong one. And then let's take her back to Fitzpiers again. So the idea that there's one unique identity that Grace can forge, in one unique love relationship in which she can create herself, is snatched away from us as well. This is not a novel which does much flattering to us as readers. It says to you, dear reader, I know that you would like to be Antony or Cleopatra, but actually you're probably not. You are someone who's sitting here reading Macmillan's magazine in a comfortable middle-class house. I'm afraid that's all that's going to happen to you. Now, I'm just going to end, I suspect that's why Helen is standing up as a reminder too, but if not, I'm going to guess at that. In the notes I was making earlier, I was thinking about Marty's love for Giles as the love story in the novel which is the most moving. He's a good man, and Marty's love for him is understandable. But as Marty says, they never speak of love. And Giles is unaware of her feelings. And you have that extraordinary moment in the novel when they're tree planting together. And remember, there's the kind of apparently erotic sign of Marty holding erect the tree, and this makes a soft sighing noise as it goes into the hole. Giles is oblivious. Giles is doing this, running his fingers through the roots of the tree. And you become conscious of the fact that the reason Marty is cold is because that lovely head of hair, which Giles ought to be running his fingers through, has been stripped away. The scene's full of sexual symbolism for a sexuality that just isn't ever going to be there. And that seems to me to be something that's, again, very powerful, very potent in the novel. When Marty finally realises that Grace is, that Giles is, when Giles finally realises that Marty is chilled to the bone and needs to run up and down to warm her feet, he sends her home. Because he says he can use a forked stick instead to hold up the tree. It's meant kindly, but it was probably the most unkind act of kindness you could possibly offer. Here is this woman deflowered of her one bright gift of time, and Giles says, doesn't matter, a forked stick will do instead. It's a bitterly sad moment in the novel. So I want to be a little kinder and just remind you of the passage near the end of the novel, so I can end with Marty. The Woodlanders are returning, swapping stories about strange things that have happened, and one day we realise this story will be another of the ones that they tell. And we see a solitary and silent girl stood there in the moonlight, a straight, slim figure, clothed in a plaitless gown, the contours of womanhood so undeveloped as to be scarcely perceptible in her. The marks of poverty and toil effaced by the misty hour, she touched sublimity at points, and looked almost like a being who had rejected with indifference the attribute of sex for the loftier quality of abstract humour. Two things I'd say about that, and then I will stop and sit down. One is she looked almost like. It's one of the sentences that critics most often quote wrong. The other one is to do with happiness being but an occasional episode of a general drama of pain from the Mayor of Canterbury, which they also quote out of context. But this is another one. Critics endlessly say she looks like someone who has rejected with indifference the attribute of sex. Harvey says she looks almost like someone. This is not true. This is something that you, as a reader, or some sympathetic spectator, might project onto Marty, but it's not really the case. She hasn't rejected it. When we come back, the other thing I want to say is I was talking about the sense of things being abstracted, things being taken away. When Hardy says that she looks like someone who's moved over to an abstract humanism, that really means she has the kind of humanity from which almost everything has been abstracted. The contours of womanhood are undeveloped because she's underfed. She has amenorrhea. She's never going to become fertile. She's going to get osteoporosis through brittle bones in her old age. All of this Hardy knows, and all this we ought to know. Extraordinarily moving as a scene, but is the story of a life from which everything has been abstracted. She's got one thing left, and that's a dead man. Nothing else. Cheers, I'll stop there.
I believe it's coffee time, Tracy, but just a brief word of thanks to Phillip for a very illuminating lecture with terrific attention, I think, to the text, and a great start to the day. As a Darwinian novel, I think clearly it is Darwinian, but it's worth thinking of Nietzsche's reinflection of Darwin, which suggests it is the weakly adaptable who survive and not the heroic. But anyway, I won't get into that now. But many thanks, Philip. When the bagpipes started, I thought Donald Farr phrase. But he didn't arrive. Anyway, thanks again, Philip.